Before March was known for madness, before college basketball fitted underdogs for glass slippers and celebrated its Cinderellas, there was the City College of New York Beavers, a team that would shock the sport in more ways than one. These days, CCNY is nothing more than a footnote in college basketball history, and maybe not even that. Less than a year after the school's biggest triumph, it became engulfed in a scandal that would force the Beavers to drop down to Division III, never to be seen again. From upsetting Kentucky and being the only Grand Slam champion in history to arrests and eventually banishment, this is the story of the original March Madness Cinderella that nearly broke college basketball. CCNY, the City College of New York. It's certainly not the first name that springs to mind when you think of college basketball. In fact, there are now more than 330 teams playing Division I basketball in the United States, and CCNY isn't among them. It is pretty surprising considering this is a former NCAA Tournament champion and a former NIT champion. Of course, when they sat atop the college basketball mountaintop, it was a far different time. The fledgling NBA was still finding its way, and programs like Adolph Rupp's Kentucky were promoting racial segregation almost fiercely so. Located in Harlem, the City College of New York has been one of America's more respected universities, in addition to being a pioneer when it comes to integration. This extended to its athletics programs and namely its basketball team. The CCNY Beavers had both black and Jewish players, many of whom were recruited from the surrounding Upper Manhattan neighborhoods. The team was led by Nat Holman, who played college ball at rival NYU. After obtaining his master's degree, he landed the head coaching gig at CCNY in 1919 and would never coach another team in his entire career. Holman enjoyed some success at CCNY over the years, guiding the team to a few NIT and NCAA tournament appearances, although those bids had less to do with on-court success and more to do with ticket sales. You see, both of those tournaments were played at Madison Square Garden, and local teams in New York City were big-time draws. Even with those postseason appearances, the Beavers had never been ranked in the top 25, and it really wasn't seen as a legitimate championship contender heading into the 1949-50 season. One thing to point out, CCNY, like most New York City teams, played almost exclusively at Madison Square Garden in these days. That's because this was the place to play college basketball. Teams would come from the Midwest and West to play against whatever school was willing to face them as part of double and triple headers that would almost always be sold out. Much like with neutral site games today, this was seen as a good way for teams to prepare for a potential NIT or NCAA tournament appearance, since both were being held at Madison Square Garden. And of course, teams were rewarded financially for playing these games in New York City. To that extent, CCNY played 12 of their 19 regular season contests at the Garden, and that's just the way it was back then. Anyway, the Beavers began the 1949-50 season with comfortable victories against Lafayette and SMU. That was followed by a close loss to Oklahoma and a 30-point blowout of Cal. This would set the stage for two huge matchups for the Beavers. The first was against UCLA, a program still finding its feet under John Wooden. While the Bruins weren't quite the powerhouse they would become in his second season at the school, they finished his first season ranked and were expected to be among the contenders at season's end. This was a close game, but ultimately UCLA provided to be too much for CCNY and emerged victorious 60-53. For City College, they would have a week to prepare for their next game, a showdown against a St. John's team that was ranked number 1 in the country. It was a showdown for New York City bragging rights, in a city where bragging rights mean more than most. In what was arguably the biggest win in program history, the Beavers would upset St. John's 54-52. A few days later, and CCNY was ranked for the first time. With momentum on their side, this would be the catalyst for a 7-game winning streak, which saw the Beavers move into the top 10. Perhaps most surprising of all was how CCNY played. This was a side going at a breakneck pace. Even by today's standard, there is something about this CCNY team that is enjoyable to watch. One thing you hear quite a bit from folks who talk about that team is the style of play and just how it was emblematic of the city of New York itself. Not only is that true, but you can still see elements of this style today and throughout the history of basketball since the Beavers took the court. It is certainly not a coincidence that Rucker Park is only 14 blocks down the street from the CCNY campus. This style of play was something that not only came from the playgrounds of Upper Manhattan, but has since returned. It is still one that can be found on courts across Harlem to this day. Sitting at 10-2 and still ranked nationally, things began to unravel for the Beavers at this stage of the season. They lost back-to-back contests against Canisius and Niagara. A pair of wins was followed by a third loss in 5 games, this one coming at the hands of Syracuse. That was enough to knock CCNY out of the top 25 and put them firmly on the postseason bubble. Wins against Manhattan and NYU improved their record to 14-5, but no one was sure if that was enough. The one thing working in the Beavers' favor was the fact that the NIT had expanded from 8 to 12 teams in 1949 and filled those extra spots with schools from New York City since they were going to sell tickets at Madison Square Garden. With Manhattan and NYU both having down years, CCNY was more or less the last team standing when it came to those from the greater New York City area, and it was enough to sneak in to the NIT. Their reward was a first-round matchup against the previous year's NIT winner, San Francisco, who was ranked 12th in the nation at the time. There wasn't much in the way of expectations for the Beavers, but they still sent the Dons packing with a 19-point loss. Kentucky, the defending back-to-back NCAA Tournament champions, and the third-ranked program in the country, was up next. There is a story out there, and one retold in City Dump, a documentary on the CCNY team that went like this. One of the school's black players tried to shake the hand of a Kentucky player before tip-off and was ignored. This incident was then used as motivation for the Beavers in their matchup against what was at the time and remains to this day a college basketball blue blood. It's hard to know just how true or false that story is, but whatever the case may be, the Beavers annihilated the Wildcats and seemed to take great delight in doing so along the way. This was Adolph Rupp's worst defeat ever at the time and one of the most significant upsets in college basketball history. That was only the semifinal. Despite knocking off Kentucky, top-ranked Bradley awaited the Beavers in the NIT finale. In what was very much a back-and-forth game, the local team finished their story and won it all. Lifting the NIT trophy, though, it wasn't just about winning, however. CCNY did it their way and beat 4 of the best teams in America in the process. Their reward was an invitation to the NCAA Tournament, which began 5 days later at Madison Square Garden. Now, a handful of teams had played in both postseason tournaments before, but none was able to emerge victorious in the dueling championships for college basketball. And while CCNY was a great Cinderella story during their NIT run, the idea this was going to be the first school to do, though, certainly seemed far-fetched heading in to the NCAA tournament. This was especially true considering their reward for being champions was a first-round matchup against Ohio State, who was ranked 2nd in the country. This was very much a vindictive move by the NCAA, who was struggling to get their tournament seen as the premier postseason event. The idea of organizers here is that they would throw City College to the wolves and then point to the fact the NIT champion lost in the first round of their tournament, as if that was some sort of proof of superiority. They never got a chance to do so, though. In a very close contest, the Beavers snuck past the Buckeyes 56-55. Another close victory in the Final Four against NC State set up a date with destiny, and standing in their way would once again be Bradley. It was not easy, but CCNY would emerge victorious 71-68, proving they were without question the sport's best team, despite being unheralded and unranked entering the season. The original March Madness Cinderella did something never seen before or since. They were the first ever, the only ever, college basketball double champion, or Grand Slam champion as they like to call it back in the day. After their plan to embarrass the NIT champion backfired, the NCAA decided teams could only play in one postseason tournament. The Grand Slam champion was a one and done. Celebrations and fame for City College were widespread, so much so that head coach Nat Holman even appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was still a relatively new program at that time in history. This was huge, massive, unprecedented. A school in Harlem with a team comprised of many black and Jewish players was on top of the world. The joy would be short-lived. The following season was not a good one for CCNY, as the loss of several key players, along with a championship hangover, saw them hover around 500 for most of the campaign. There were several curious losses during this season that caused some confusion. For example, a 37-point output in a lopsided defeat to Missouri was a real head-scratcher. So too were low-scoring losses to Oklahoma and Arizona. What was happening on the court would turn out to be the least of the team's concern, as the season was nearing its end. As the team was returning from Philadelphia after playing against Temple in the penultimate game of the season, CCNY players Ed Warner, Ed Roman, and Al Roth were arrested at Penn Station in New York City. College basketball was never to be the same again. While illegal, sports betting was widespread in New York City and in big cities across the country, with mob bookies found on many corners. Going all the way back to the 1930s, and college basketball had been a target for point shaving, with the mafia looking to control the outcomes and ensure their business was lucrative. As for the 3 CCNY players to have been arrested, they were caught up in a sprawling web of college basketball point shaving. Detectives were using wiretaps and snitches to uncover everything. The entire operation had been overseen by well-known mob fixers Salvatore Tarto Salazzo and former Long Island University player Eddie Gard. Those two had told the cops what they had done and who was involved. For the police, it was just a matter of rounding everyone up. The Beavers players who were arrested admitted to shaving points in 3 matches of the 1950-51 season, all of which happened to be the team's 3 lowest scoring games of the campaign. In hindsight, the scandal does explain CCNY's terrible play following their Grand Slam victory. Things would only get worse for CCNY as more players were arrested a few weeks later. The real bombshell, though, that came when players on the Grand Slam winning team were also found to have been shaving points during the regular season of their championship campaign. 3 games, losses to UCLA and Niagara, and a win against SMU, all featured point shaving. No tournament games were part of the scandal, nor was it ever suggested that the team lost on purpose. Beyond that, only 1 CCNY player out of the 7 arrested would serve jail time. The scandal wasn't just a city college problem, though. It was an issue at all of the major New York City schools, with LIU, Manhattan, and NYU involved. Long Island University in particular was found to have thrown games. The story does not end here. Bradley, who CCNY beat for both titles, had players implicated in point shavings for games held in Chicago and Philadelphia, with these activities uncovered during this police investigation. The biggest fish of all, though, was Kentucky. As all of this was going down, Adolph Rupp boasted, "They couldn't reach my boys with a 10-foot pole." The Wildcats were involved, just like everyone else. The more New York District Attorney Frank Hogan kept digging, the more dirt that came up. In 1949, Wildcat players Ralph Beard, Alex Groza, and Dale Barnstable had accepted bribes to shave points in an NIT game against Loyola of Chicago. Ironically enough, those Wildcats were attempting to be the first team to win the NIT and NCAA tournaments in the same season. They were bounced by Loyola because those players had to keep the points down in order to receive their money from the mob. Ahead of the 1952-53 season, Kentucky's All-American center Bill Spivey was suspended from the team after his teammates had accused him of being part of nefarious activities as it related to gambling. The Wildcats went from untouchable, in the words of Rupp, to being handed down the death penalty for a season by the NCAA. By the way, these are just the examples uncovered by police. Point shaving was widely assumed to be rampant across the country. It permeated college basketball. Yet, City College was the one who bore the brunt of the entire ordeal. Kentucky was welcomed back into the fold after the death penalty. Nothing truly bad befell Bradley. NYU and Manhattan carried on. Long Island, the only school found to have thrown games, shuttered its entire athletic program in the aftermath of the scandal, but resumed again in the 1960s and was a full-fledged D1 member by 1968. City College was not so lucky. The school dropped down to Division III after the 1952-53 season and have remained there to this day. At present, it's the only school to have won the national championship and not be still in Division I. Unfairly, this ordeal is almost always referred to as the CCNY point shaving scandal, not the Kentucky point shaving scandal, not the Long Island University point shaving scandal, not the Bradley point shaving scandal. Nearly 75 years later, and it seems unjust, City College wasn't the only ones involved in this. They were no more so part of the scandal than any other school involved. This is not meant to marginalize their actions. Point shaving is a serious offense, and CCNY should have been punished just like all of those other schools. It must be pointed out that the school's administration did play a part in this downfall as well. Academics had always been at the forefront, so there was not much of an appetite to do damage control on an athletic scandal. What's more, there had long been rumors that basketball players at City College had not properly passed admissions tests, nor were they as committed to their studies as regular students. The path of least resistance was to wash their hands of everything and de-emphasize athletics. It was the easiest way to avoid whatever punishment the NCAA would hand out, and the easiest way to avoid any bad press. A story of triumph, a story of integration and an air of segregation, a story of Cinderella overcoming the odds in March has been more or less disregarded. The legacy of CCNY is undoubtedly complicated. They are by no means upstanding heroes or the most honorable team to have ever played. There certainly needs to be context placed around them and the team's actions during their Grand Slam winning season. However, they are the only Grand Slam champion in college basketball history. They will forever be the only Grand Slam champion in college basketball history, and they did so in the most fitting way imaginable, as an unranked underdog knocking off college basketball's giants. Before March was mad, before underdogs were given glass slippers when they triumphed in college basketball's postseason, there was the City College of New York.